And good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early morning briefing for Friday, the 18th of July, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Happy Friday, everyone. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here, starting with President Trump. The White House announced that President Trump was recently diagnosed with chronic venous insufficiency after people raised concerns about his bruised hands and swollen ankles in a recent appearance. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt claims that President Trump has no discomfort and that the physician said he was in otherwise excellent health. Also, yesterday, one of the things I wrote in the analyst comment in the report and also said on the show was that I thought the backlash could lead to a partial release of the Epstein files. And that is probably what we're seeing right now. Citing backlash among the MAGA base, President Trump called on Attorney General Pam Bondi to release the grand jury transcripts pertaining to the Epstein case. And Bondi said she would make those files available. This is not the client list. It is not the whole Epstein file, but it is something. And maybe that's the White House's attempt to assuage the MAGA base. Raising a stink tends to work. I have noticed this on a handful. President Trump said, we're going to look at amnesty for farm workers who are illegal. And the MAGA base said, no, let's not. And then later the White House said, yeah, we're actually not going to do that. So I think there's actually some responsiveness happening here, which is a good sign. Moving on, Jared, let's bring you on and talk about this. So in the over in the House of Representatives, they have a select committee on China, and the chair, who's a Republican of that committee, is warning that the United States should not let China have any voice in Panama. What's the latest?
Yes. So this is coming from Representative Molinar. He sent a letter to Panama and the Panama Maritime Authority there, urging them do not allow any Chinese company that is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, which is all of them, to have any seat at the table on this port deal. And the reason he did this is that there was a report that China was considering only approving the deal if the Costco Shipping Corporation is allowed. I think I saw it was like 49% share. So not a controlling share, but that's an enormous amount. Basically, there's rumors that China will try to maintain control over this port. Plain and simple. And he's telling Panama, absolutely do not do this. We will get involved.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's something that's very important. We've seen China get much more heavily involved in Panama. And, Jared, just to tie this in, this goes back to Chinese. It's not even really just economic dominance. China wants to control some of these economic choke points. I mean, they've tried to get more heavily involved in Suez. They've been, what's the stat? They have a share in like 1/3 or maybe up to 2/3 of the world's major ports. They have some economic interest, some investment, or maybe even a controlling interest. I forget we've published maps on that before. And now they want to control the Panama Canal, which is a vital shipping lane for the United States. Like simply cannot be allowed to happen.
Yeah. They're always trying to get at least a permanent presence there, even if it's not a military presence. They always want somewhere to be. They always want to be at least partially in a port, and you can see that in their technology transfers too. We've covered the port crane issue quite a bit. That still counts as far as China is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. If you control the port cranes and you can shut them down, may as well not even have a port there. All right. Effectively, you kind of don't. So and just briefly, Jared, what has Panama's response to all this been? Because I know there's been some carrot and sticking by the United States, and Panama seems more likely to side with the United States in some of these cases, or they have in the past.
So on this particular rumor, I haven't seen a response from Panama yet. However, they are auditing CK Hutchison, which is partially what's driving this deal anyway. CK Hutchison, just for those that don't remember, is the group the Chinese group that currently controls Cristobal and drawing a blank on the other port. On the other and they're selling it. Yes, and they're selling all those ports to BlackRock. So Panama's conducting an audit. They are actually trying to pare down a lot on Chinese influence, but they also claim outright, no, China doesn't have major influence over us. We're neutral. And it's not necessarily true. They just want to appear as neutral as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's crazy given how close geographically they are to the United States and how powerful the United States is. It's somewhat concerning how they keep trying to hold hands with China.
Yeah. And the fact that basically the only reason they're known is due to the canal, which the United States built.
And maybe taking back at some point. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We will move on here through the sitrep. So the Department of Interior announced yesterday that they're going to eliminate some of the discounts for existing and future wind and solar projects. So apparently there's some maybe federal subsidizing going on there. And this is meant to, they say, the Department of Interior says, create a level playing field for dispatchable, cost-effective, and secure energy sources such as clean coal and domestic natural gas. Financial Times yesterday had an article, a long article about the energy crunch that we've been talking about for 2 years. I mean, even last year, I recorded like an hour-long video on the energy problem this country has. And just looking through the numbers and looking through the projections of what the Biden, which fossil fuel powered power plants were being taken offline, and there was not enough capacity in quote unquote green energy being built to make up for it. The conclusion is very clear. Not only do we currently have power shortages, so there's just not enough juice, but electricity costs we're going to get much higher. And also we would eventually, some regions would probably run into a wall because power demand is just rising far too fast than new generating capacity that's coming online. So then the Trump administration got to work and they started telling these fossil fuel fired power plants not to close down and extending retirement dates. And so this looks like another opportunity for them to shift the balance of financial and economic feasibility in favor of quote unquote dispatchable energy, which includes things like coal and domestic natural gas. All around, very good sign for U.S. grid stability. At any rate, this Financial Times article cited an energy company think tank, and they could be incredibly biased. I don't know. But they were actually projecting for total generating capacity to be reduced over the next 10 years. And so that's something that Robert's the real guy on this. He's been out this week. He'll be back on Monday. We'll dig into it and get back with you because this is going to continue to be a major problem to the point where it could result in planned or unplanned power outages for residential areas. So something we're going to continue to keep an eye on. Moving on, we have two items to cover about ICE. They arrested 4 people in northern Arizona earlier this week for conspiring to transport and harbor illegal aliens, as well as, quote, knowingly employing unauthorized aliens. And during this raid on this business, several illegal aliens were also arrested, and federal officials and local county sheriffs publicized the arrests in local areas. And Jared, you covered this, and that these were U.S. business owners who were arrested for hiring illegals.
Yes, two of the people were U.S. business owners. 2 of the other ones, I think they're still American citizens, but it was kind of unclear whether or not they were also dual Mexican citizens, because they had access down to the southern border to actually facilitate bringing people over. And I mean, reading their names, they were clearly Mexican anyhow, but also it's Arizona. So yes, at least 2 Americans. I think all 4 were Americans here, and they were business owners. Both 2 pairs of business owners. One of them had a front business in order to actually conduct the trafficking.
I see. So that's one of the things that I've seen a lot on social media is why is ICE or why is the Trump administration, the DOJ, not going after U.S. business owners that knowingly hire and employ illegal aliens? And I think part of the answer is because some of these illegals pretty infamously use fraud. They'll use someone else's social security number. They'll, there's been cases where ICE will go in and, arrest 5, 10, 15 people. And ICE says, all these people have the same address on their employment paperwork. So obviously a fair amount of fraud going on there. And I guess that's the big reason. I guess the other thing is it may be politically sensitive, but I'll tell you, if you want American-owned businesses to stop hiring illegals, holding the people who hire them accountable seems like a pretty good strategy.
Absolutely. I did think it was important to note that both federal officials and local officials were saying, hey, we did this, because that is telling them you're next if you're still employing illegals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another thing I've noticed. Tom Homan and Pam Bondi have said, they've come out and really in no uncertain terms, they kind of say, yeah, if you don't want to wind up in a prison in El Salvador, you don't want to wind up in Alligator Alcatraz, you don't want to be shipped off to whatever this new place in Africa they're sending him to, then just leave, just self-deport. And we are not going to send you to El Salvador. We're not going to send you to Africa. So a lot of this also is strategic messaging. So, all right, thanks for that, Jared. Last item here on ICE. Reportedly, I'm sure there's going to be a federal judge somewhere that issues an injunction on this. But for now, ICE is reportedly going to be given access to Medicaid data, things like names and addresses, for 79 million Medicaid enrollees. And ICE say they're going to search for illegal aliens who are receiving Medicaid payments who are also in the country illegally. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to the global sitrep. Jared, welcome back, and please take it from the top.
All right. So the State Department announced a few sanctions on 6 high-ranking members of the Tren de Aragua. This includes bounties on the leader and co-founder of the gang for $5 million and $4 million respectively. More big news out of South America. Colombian President Gustavo Petro and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro signed an agreement to create what they're calling a zone of peace, union, and binational development. Now, they believe this zone should allow for joint development, both industry and actual, residential development along their border region, greater what they're calling regularization of foreign exchange at the border, and potentially energy cooperation between them. And we've covered Colombia's shift away from the United States sphere of influence, pretty extensively just this week. But I thought it was exceptionally important to note that there is, from the Trump administration, an open threat for tariffs and sanctions on any country that imports Venezuelan oil. And if you're going to develop energy cooperation between Colombia and Venezuela, that necessitates, actually importing Venezuelan oil. So we could see this blow up quite a bit more. Moving over to Israel, got a couple of items on them. First, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced yesterday that Israel, quote, will not allow Syrian army forces to enter the region south of Damascus. Now, he stated that this is to protect the Druze minority there, that they also struck the defense ministry of Syria for, and to enforce the demilitarization of the region. Now, a unilateral demilitarization basically requires a military to enforce that order, and it kind of looks like they're just seizing the territory, if I'm being frank here.
Jared, briefly, that's something that we have also brought up. Certain Israeli officials have actually talked about annexing parts of southern Syria because they say there are these Christian and Druze communities that the current Syrian government is not protecting, and by some accounts at least, actually trying to are murdering. And so some Israeli officials, probably like 6 months ago, came out and said, we're not going to allow this to happen. We'll have to go in and annex southern Syria if we have to.
Yes. And so just to kind of put it in perspective, Damascus, the capital of Syria, would actually be just outside of this map here. This is an official map it's a semi-official map from the government of Israel on Golan Heights and the demilitarized zone. So this is extremely close to the Syrian capital, and I think this will end up leading to a continuation of fighting here. They claim there's a ceasefire, but they also claim there's a ceasefire on Tuesday, and then they violated it, as the Israeli ceasefires do. Staying in Israel, the U.S. ambassador to Israel threatened the Israeli interior minister. He threatened to publicly announce, this is a quote, publicly announce throughout the United States that the state of Israel no longer welcomes Christian organizations, and that Israel instead harasses them and treats them negatively. And this threat actually came after several prominent Christian organizations had their visa applications outright ignored by Israel after the United States State Department had given them a recommendation for approval. This is just the latest indicator in an increasingly souring U.S.-Israeli relationship, and I think it's very important to note that Mike Huckabee has historically been very pro-Israel. It caught me off guard here to read his name attached to this.
Absolutely. That was shocking for me to read as well. Back when I used to watch Fox News, Mike Huckabee would be on those commercials talking about Israel being our greatest ally, and for him to come out and say that Christians aren't welcome in Israel. First of all, I've heard that from a lot of people, and again, it depends really on who you ask. However, we just saw a couple days ago, there was this Prime Minister Netanyahu came out and said that it was unfortunate. Apparently, I'm not sure if it was a bomb or a tank round. He said it mistakenly hit a church in Gaza, which may be the only Catholic church. I read that online. Of course, it has to be true because I read it online. But it's one of the relatively few Christian facilities there, and that round did kill 3 Christians, and I think injure 9 others maybe. And this is not the only time that we have seen the IDF mistakenly or inadvertently, quote unquote, target some of those Christian churches. So that's unfortunate to see, but it is very shocking that Huckabee would come out and say something like this. Realistically, I'm not sure what that does to the relationship with the Trump administration. I know President Trump has had his own rifts with Netanyahu. So Jared, just, look, was there any indication here from the ambassador that there were going to be some rift in the relationship?
I think so. His opening statement, which I included here in my notes, is that, hey, I'm the U.S. ambassador. I'm representing President Donald Trump, and I'm formally demanding that this deteriorating relationship with the Department of State be resolved so this does not escalate further. So basically, the way Huckabee's saying is that, hey, you're leaving us. You're destroying this relationship, and I will escalate this if I need to. So approve what I tell you to. It's honestly, it looks like the entire relationship's on the rocks. I realize that they are actually formally a major non-NATO ally. However, that status can be revoked.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's difficult for me to see that happening. However, and let me just mention this, it's complete speculation, but this goes back to the Epstein files and some accusations which may be credible that, and I don't even want to get into this because it's kind of outside the purview. And also most people who talk about this just simply don't know what they're talking about. However, I have seen some folks in Trump world say that the 180 on releasing the Epstein files may be directly related to this Israel-Iran peace deal. That may have been a card on the table to get Israel to not continue to pursue a larger Mideast conflict. We'll leave that there. With that, Jared, speaking of war, let's go ahead and move on to NATO, because NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is talking about he's kind of swinging here for the Trump administration, talking about these tariffs.
Did you want to skip to that, or do you want to do the second?
Excuse me. Yeah, sorry. We'll cover that later in the show. For now, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about NATO must prepare for a 2-front war.
Okay. So this is coming from the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for NATO, General Alexis Grinkewicz. So he repeated to the European Defense Conference this week that NATO must prepare for a 2-front war against Russia and China. Basically the same thing as, hey, when China moves on Taiwan, expect Russia to move into Europe. how realistic that is to be debated, but they are at least preparing for it, taking it seriously. He also repeated several times that there's very little time to rearm Europe, and that his entire mission as the Supreme Allied Commander will be to ensure that all NATO allies use their increased funding. Reminder that they just shot up to 5% as a mandatory floor. That they're going to use it on the right military priorities, which will primarily be air defense, according to what he's saying here, is get more Patriots, build more Patriots, get everything we can to, prevent essentially long-range strikes inside of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is also interesting. You hear a senior NATO official saying NATO has to prepare to fight a two-front war, and you say, okay, what is that? Ukraine and the Baltics, but it's not. It's against one front is against Russia, the so-called eastern flank, which is really just the front-facing part of NATO, and China as the second one. And Jared, we have seen increased NATO deployments, like the British and the French. Weren't the Germans trying to conduct some kind of Indo-Pacific sea mission as well?
They did send one last year, I think it was, and they conducted a straight transit for the first time in a very long time. My base assumption as far as NATO and Europe are concerned in a Pacific war is the major players, UK, France, and Italy may be involved navally, but generally it's going to be they're going to be economic warfare players, not necessarily military players in that region. Just they're going to have so much other stuff on their plate at the time. I don't think it's necessarily feasible for them to send a whole lot over there.
Mm-hmm. Just one other thing briefly. The EU, just as a body, their decision makers have been striking all these deals with China. And I remember this was a big deal several years ago when Germany struck a deal with Huawei to bring in 5G hardware into Germany, maybe some other European countries here. And I don't know if hopefully they've realized this, Jared, but you just look at the state of Chinese cyber warfare and Chinese backdoors. I mean, yesterday we talked about how China is allowing Chinese companies to do network reconnaissance and exploitation, basically scoping out targets, and they turn around and they sell them to the Chinese government or the Chinese military. And what's happening here is these Chinese cyber units, they're just buying these backdoors, they're buying these exploits that these companies are going after, and they've got a massive target deck. And this is not to action during a time of crisis or conflict, maybe a Tuesday afternoon. And the United States can't be the only target. I mean, this has to be NATO countries as well. It's just very shocking to me it's shocking to me when senior NATO leaders come out and say, yeah, we've got to prepare to go fight a war with China, while those countries' leaders are continuing to import Chinese hardware, which is going to be a massive security issue for them.
I have noticed a bit of a dichotomy there. It seems like the politicians of Europe want to present a strong face to President Trump and America, saying, "Oh no, we're not dealing with that. We can go over there." But anytime that Europe, the EU, or any individual European countries actually interact with China, it's normally on just bad footing. It seems like every day I see another minor, "Oh, we're not allowing this from China to come in here," or China going, "Okay, well, we're not allowing this type of wine coming in." They don't, in the less forward-looking areas, they're not on good terms. And I think Europe is, at least internally, very aware that they have to go with the United States. They cannot move over to China at all. Mm-hmm. Not to mention their primary security commander, NATO Secretary General, he just dealt with a major Chinese cyber attack on I think it was their lithography industry. It was last year when he was prime minister.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. One other thing too, the EU has seen this being shaped for many years. I remember back in 2017, there was a Chinese delegation that traveled to Brussels for high-level trade talks. And according to EU officials involved there, the Chinese overtly made them an offer to break trade ties with the United States and pivot to China. And, these Chinese trade negotiators said, we can give you everything you need. Whatever the United States has given you, we or Chinese allies or this sphere can give you. And they tried to have a hard break between the EU and the United States. And the EU obviously balked and walked away from it. But I think the Chinese have attempted that twice now. And this was back in 2017 during the first Trump tariff 1.0 was happening. So, this is something that China has also been trying to influence EU and by extension NATO away from having this kind of conflict with China. Hasn't worked. So the writing's on the wall. Thanks for that, Jared. All right, with that, we're tracking 357 protests. By the way, is that just today or is that through this weekend?
I'm sorry, that's supposed to say this weekend.
Okay, great. All right, well, that's about baseline. And listen, yesterday was the John Lewis Day of Action, and nothing I haven't seen anything. Basically, nothing happened. All right, with that, guys, speaking of nothing happening, I'm sharing this with you just because I saw it pop up in my feed today. I could kind of go either way on whether this is or isn't going to lead to something much worse. However, a handful of anarchist websites and blogs are issuing a call to action for a quote-unquote Black August of direct action. And this is in retribution for the death of 3 anarchist militants. One of those guys is, they call him Tortuga or Tortuguita, and he was an Antifa militant who was shot and killed by police in Atlanta. He was part of that Stop Cop City movement. So there actually has been a fair amount of arson and other cases of what they call retribution for his shooting death. However, this missive it addresses, quote unquote, anonymous insurgents to, quote, leave your mark and act as you see fit. I look at this Black August. I think they ran something like Black August last year for something. I forget exactly what it was for, but nothing happened. Nothing ever happens. These anarchist groups and websites and blogs, they routinely call for periods of action. We're going to do a day of action. We're going to do a week of action, a month of action. And I cannot say that these calls regularly result in spikes of violent or destructive activity, although there's always the risk, whether it's a day of action or not. Historically, anarchist militants and these groups, they don't really need a specific event to carry out some direct action, property destruction, arson, vandalism, whatever. But just looking at the rising social temperature, I think that could be more likely that it's going to produce some events throughout August. I'm sharing this with you because it could be significant, but I'll just, again, throw in a caveat. It could be, but this would not be the first time we've seen a call to action go unheeded. And really, it's just a way different security environment today. That's one of the things I have noticed on previous podcasts and some of these blogs is there's a much higher risk because these groups, they are operating in less friendly territory for the most part. They are being arrested. They are being charged. The charges are sticking. And, anything that rises to the federal level obviously is going to carry a much greater risk than it did 7-8 months ago. So, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. President Trump is reportedly expected to sign an executive order soon, maybe today, that's going to open the $9 trillion retirement market to cryptocurrency investments. Earlier this year, BlackRock, just as an aside, this is something we reported maybe a month ago. BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager, I think with like at least $11-12 trillion in assets under management, they said that they were expanding their crypto operations and that they wanted to become the world's largest crypto asset management firm. And if you're just looking at the big trends, that's obviously a lot more institutional money piling into Bitcoin. There's a guy that I follow on Twitter/X. He's a financial guy. He posts a lot of technical analysis and charts and his takes. And the other day he said, Bitcoin will never go any higher than $112,000. Because they just completed the 5th Elliott wave, and that's it. There's nothing but resistance from here. The Bitcoin price will never go higher. I mean, guys, you just look at the future of the dollar that is weakening. When Bitcoin goes up priced in dollars, Bitcoin's not exactly going up. It's the value of the dollar that's declining against Bitcoin. And so you just look at the future weakness in the dollar. Bitcoin has to go above 120, and it did. It was like up at 117. I don't know what it's up today. But it was at 117,000. And so I remember just several years ago, I've dabbled in Bitcoin since 2014. I started accepting it on the very first Forward Observer website. And so just full disclosure there. But it was a couple years ago, maybe 2020. I started seeing all these institutions, Fidelity and BlackRock, and all these big money power players, the market movers, say, we're going to open up purchases of Bitcoin to clients. We're going to allow our clients to buy crypto through us. And I just said, that is a ton of money that's about to pour into Bitcoin. And yeah, I've like probably 10x after that, or maybe even more. So yeah, I mean, Bitcoin at that time was maybe trading at like, I don't know, $2,000, maybe $3,000. So I don't know, do the math, 20x plus 20x. 50x. Do some math here. Yeah, so Bitcoin 50x from there. And the big sign was so much institutional money was about to pour into Bitcoin. So I just look at this. I'm not sure how many people running retirement accounts are actually going to say, oh yeah, I'm going to retire next year. Let me sink a bunch of money into Bitcoin. Because traditionally you look at retirement accounts and it's very conservative. It's mostly in bonds and other forms of quote unquote safe assets. So just from a strategic perspective, I see the Trump administration continue their efforts to mainstream crypto adoption. Certain members of the administration see crypto assets as the future of finance, DeFi versus TradFi, et cetera. And I think they do want to facilitate U.S. dominance in what they see as the next financial system. Again, maybe it's a little counterproductive to add high volatility crypto assets to traditional low volatility retirement accounts. I think that's interesting. But it is clear that there's absolutely a big push to mainstream adoption of Bitcoin and other crypto assets. Something we'll keep an eye on. But, and again, this is not financial advice. I don't provide financial advice. I would not be surprised to see Bitcoin sink 50% at some point in the future, but it has to go much higher. It will go much higher. It has to, because the value of the dollar is going to decline over the long term. I mean, everyone can see this happening. And it's happened over the past, since 1913 as well. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. All right, Jared, let's finally talk about NATO advancing these Trump tariffs, basically warning these other countries that Trump tariffs are coming for you. And it's a very clear sign that NATO, apparently, according to Secretary General Mark Rutte, NATO is behind this. Like, they support it.
Yes. So just quick bit of background for those that may have forgotten, missed it. President Trump threatened 100% secondary tariffs on all of Russia's remaining trade partners if Russia does not achieve a ceasefire by about September 1st. Now, like you said, he announced this during his meeting with the Secretary General. So Secretary General Mark Rutte here is warning basically all of Russia's major trade partners, Brazil, China, and India. Guys, he's serious. He will do this. Europe is going to back him. And so far, the response has not been very amenable. Brazil's foreign minister described the warning as an unreasonable threat. And that's a common thread. All of them are taking Rutte's warning as a threat rather than a warning. India's Ministry of External Affairs said that India's energy requirements are the priority and that Europe should avoid double standards because Europe buys a fair bit of Russian energy. And China has had no official response, but they did use the Global Times under the outlet's moniker to call NATO's warning not only childish, but unrealistic. We're not pressuring Russia for a ceasefire. It's not going to happen. And then secondarily, the U.S. Senate has a bill in progress that would actually mandate a 500% tariff for countries that trade with China or with Russia. Sorry. So mirroring and expanding on what President Trump's threat is. And that would also be in addition to the 100% in the event that all of these pass at once.
Mm-hmm. All right. So September 1st is the drop dead date on here.
He said 50 days from the date when I counted it out, that you could, if you count day one as the day that he said it, it would be September 1st. If you count the next day, it's September 2nd, but about September 1st there.
Okay. So roughly a month and a half to figure out what happens. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Very interesting. And with that, I think we do have some questions. Guys, let me just say a couple of things here. Really just in with regard to Bitcoin. I'm not like a hardcore Bitcoin bro. However, it is very an interesting opportunity to move your store of wealth off the dollar system. And there's obviously been some of that happening. I don't think it's in the near term. I don't think it's obviously not enough to tank the dollar, like to destroy the dollar. It's not enough to destroy treasuries, obviously. And as I say on the show, and a lot of other people say, yeah, the dollar is the worst currency in the world, except for all the others. And the treasuries are the worst bonds in the world, except for all the others, or except for most of the others. So, I just look at the dollar system, and long term, yeah, it's extremely concerning. Long term, the dollar system as we know it will cease to exist. It has to. You can go back to my conversation with Michael Every a couple months ago, where he really breaks that down, and he goes through the mechanics and explains why this will happen eventually. And then you look at the treasury markets, and no one comes close. You look at the dollar as the world reserve currency, no one comes close. But people are looking, I think they are mapping out and getting into some of these escape pods. So, point being, Bitcoin is very interesting to me because it does allow you to move money off the U.S. financial system. And a lot of people are doing that with an eye on the future, the next 5, 10, 20 years. There's also a couple, before we get to any questions, there's also a couple questions in here about, is Bitcoin real? And is Bitcoin fiat? Is Bitcoin listen, the Bitcoin defenders will say, yeah, Bitcoin is ones and zeros. And a lot of people say, well, nothing backs Bitcoin. It's not linked to anything. It's not backed by anything other than the network effect. People say it has value, therefore it has value. And people say, well, there's a lot of Bitcoin infrastructure and institutional money and institutional adoption and financial rails being built just to use crypto assets in general. And that's what backs Bitcoin, which I think is actually a fair point. So, point being, I look at Bitcoin and I say, this is a viable place to stick some money. I think it's prudent to do that for a lot of reasons. But one of those reasons is we just know what's going to happen to the dollar over the long term. And so I think, just looking at institutional investment and global demand, I think it's a good long-term bet. Long-term. In the near term, it's extremely volatile. So hold on, as they say. All right, Sarah Adams has been posting for a while about an attack targeting airplanes. I believe I know her credentials are top-notch. What are your thoughts? Yeah, I've covered this multiple times. I don't have any reason to doubt her. I mean, I would take what she says credibly. I'm not going to change my routines because of it. There have been a lot, there's another question here, but one of Sarah Adams' main criticism is that nobody seems to be taking this seriously. And so that is obviously concerning to me. So those are my thoughts generally. I've covered this many times. I won't go into the details again. But I think you should treat what she says credibly. Okay, next question. We talked a lot about South America and Latin America and how we've lost some influence there. Looking back at the rate we're currently losing influence, how long before we got serious trouble? Well, Jared, I would say Panama is important. And it seems like the countries at the greatest risk seem to be Panama and Colombia. Lula da Silva, once he got elected, Brazil had this pivot towards China. China started shifting away their agriculture purchases away from the United States in favor of Brazil. And that was going back to 2017, maybe 2019, somewhere in there. Definitely by 2022, they were doing it. So Brazil does stand to gain a lot from this Chinese relationship. I think one thing I've talked about before is extrapolation error. and that you see a trend, and the human mind says, well, let's just take that trend out another 5 or 10 years, and oh, that's catastrophic. Well, trends can be stopped. Trends can be reversed. I mean, this is a two-way range. There's use of power, and there's countervailing use of power. And we're going to see countervailing use of power by the United States to prevent South America from tilting towards China. I noticed, I said multiple times in the past couple of weeks, pointed out, 4 of the 5 top South American countries have elections coming up in the rough next 15 to 18 months, including Colombia and Brazil. I believe Brazil. And so we could see a major shift back towards the right in South America. But in the meantime, Jared, what would you consider, what would need to have happened? What would need to happen before you say we've got serious trouble in South America?
I think we already do. Like, oh, well, China would have to have like a megaport or something on the Pacific coast that could get food over to them in less than a month. Or, they would have to have at least a presence near the Panama Canal to shut it down and prevent trade between even New York and LA, unless you want to go over rail. Like, well, they've got that. And both of those actually interact with each other. They would have to have, potentially some, influence inside of all of the various criminal organizations down throughout Latin America. And they very well may. At the very least, it appears the Chinese have a criminal presence there, even if they do not have an alliance with them. That's
for sure
concerning. Yeah. Like, all of this is major. And then if you we've got serious issues. And to top it all off, I will never forget that stat until they change it. 1% of ISR assets are dedicated to LATAM. Holy cow. Okay. Got it. We're not even looking, and we know that there's major issues there. And I think, honestly, that's why you're seeing the Trump administration push so hard south, where even Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first visits were Latin America. First ones. Like, we have to secure that. You don't get Fortress North America without it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we definitely don't get Fortress North America without Mexico. And I guess you can make the argument without Panama either. I remember when previous General Laura Richardson, she was the previous commander of Southcom. I remember when she said that Southcom gets about 1% of U.S. ISR. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So like drones, satellite, etc. Part of the thing that makes up for that is those U.S. allies in South America doing the intelligence collection with their organic ISR assets. So I don't think this is a case where Southcom is just completely blind outside of what the U.S. gives it. I think we're obviously tapped into a lot of those countries' intelligence collection or intelligence sharing programs. So just to say that as a counterpoint, I think bottom line here, the Trump administration, they've got a lot more carrot left. They got a lot more stick left to deal with Panama, to deal with Colombia. We do have elections coming up. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the elections are largely going to determine the course of action for the Trump administration. If a pro-U.S. candidate gets elected, then we'll see things change. If anti-U.S. candidates or pro-China candidates continue to get elected like they were in Brazil and Colombia with Gustavo Petro and Lula da Silva, both of whom are leftists, then we're probably going to need to see a lot more carrot or a lot more stick. So thanks for that, Jared. Next question. Do you think these days of action are more organically organized or structured through NGOs or foreign governments? I think this is a handful of these, maybe an anarchist group or website just saying, hey, let's have a call to action. A day of rage. They've previously called these things days of rage. So I think it's more organic. I mean, I don't see a lot of organization behind it. And there's not enough action for these things to be funded in the traditional sense or facilitated by NGOs or foreign governments. If NGOs or foreign governments are facilitating these days of action, these days of rage, and nothing happens, then they're doing a really bad job. Next question. Regarding Black August and the call for action, if there isn't a big turnout, do you consider that an indicator moving forward? Yeah, absolutely. I look at these things as a metric of the state of the far left, something that I've heard on podcasts and seen written about on blogs for the past couple of years now, is that there has been a sense of demoralization because they didn't achieve their aims in 2020. They went out and rioted and committed acts of violence and property destruction. And for what? They're weaker today than they were in 2017. They're still struggling to gain traction in many places, especially the places where they're far more active in 2017. So I don't think their activity necessarily has dropped off, but they're operating in a previous phase. They've been pushed back after 2020, 2021. They're pushed back to the organizational phase 1, as opposed to like a middle phase, which traditionally is going to be a lot more direct action, a lot more violence and property destruction. So yeah, I definitely look at that as a key indicator. What would happen if the government made Bitcoin and other crypto illegal? What would happen to the value? Well, I guess previous administrations have done what they call attack the on-ramps. So certain banks have said, we're not going to work with Coinbase, or we're not going to move money to other financial institutions where that allow you to purchase cryptocurrency. So, I mean, it is possible at some point. That's one of the things I think were floated by some economists or some financial or monetary observers. They say, well, if you ban crypto, then you generate more support for the dollar because there's just fewer places for dollars to go. I think that's pretty short-sighted. What would happen to the value? Well, I would just look at supply demand. If you have a lot of, here's one thing: if the United States were at some point in the future under another administration to attack the rails and not allow Bitcoin to be sold, then they don't allow Bitcoin to be bought. So my expectation is there would be some kind of price stasis there. But for Bitcoin, I guess the big thing is, do the people holding Bitcoin attempt to sell? And if they physically can't sell, then, I don't know. I would expect, I don't know. I would have to think through that. I think it depends on a lot of things. Also, I define illegal in how they do that. I mean, I think the biggest thing is how they shut down Bitcoin transactions, which I think with enough effort, they could probably do a pretty good number on it. I would have to talk to some cyber folks to really look at how feasible that is. Outside the United States, I don't know. So basically, I just wasted 2 minutes of your time. All right. Have we had any updates on the Chinese manufactured telecom infrastructure that services areas in and around key U.S. military sites? Could be key for 2027 if the PLA does indeed kick it off. Then, Jared.
I remember reporting that they were at least starting to address that, but I don't think any concrete actions have been taken yet. Mm-hmm. There's, as it comes out, I will actually report on that quite a bit. But I haven't seen anything concrete yet.
Okay. Yeah, I do want to address this real quick. When the lights go off, Bitcoin doesn't exist. Well, that's not true, because Bitcoin still exists. I mean, that's the great thing about Bitcoin. It does still exist on the ledgers. And so even if the lights were to go out in the United States, or even if the United States were to ban Bitcoin, you could still go to another country. And if you remember 12 words, or you have them written down, whatever, I mean, you could literally wash up on the shores of some other country, Panama, Costa Rica, whatever, pick your country. And if you can get access to a cell phone in 12 words, you can recover your crypto wallets, you can recover your Bitcoin, and go out and trade it for whatever you want. So this whole thing about when the lights go off, Bitcoin doesn't exist. When the lights go off, brother, you got a lot more problems than not having access to your Bitcoin. So if we do get to that problem, I think Bitcoin is probably going to be the least of your worries. How do you think the labor movement will change with AI becoming more widely used? Well, I mean, I think there's obviously going to be a lot greater push for universal basic income as workers lose their jobs to AI robots. See the writing on the wall there. I think we are going to have a showdown with socialism, things like Medicare for all and UBI. And if the job loss is as bad as they're saying, then the labor movement will probably more or less, I'm not sure that they'll necessarily pivot, but they will lose some power in their members because there will be fewer members, but they may actually end up gaining power through demand for, demand not to use robotics and use humans. So tough to say. I think a lot of this is, it really depends on how bad the job loss in AI is, and if AI actually ends up creating jobs that we can't even fathom today, which maybe will happen. By the way, crypto equals an inflation sink. I've seen people say that. There was a commodities trader on Twitter a few years ago, and he and I went back and forth about Bitcoin. And he said, "Oh, don't get into Bitcoin. It's Warren Buffett calls it rat poison, and it's going to zero. And Bitcoin is nothing. It's not backed by anything. It's completely fiat." And I'm not actually sure how well he actually understood the mechanics of Bitcoin. But one of the things he said is it's a rug pull. He said the financial interests, they're trying to drive a lot of retail money. Basically, his thing was, well, what's one way to curb inflation? Drive everyone into Bitcoin or drive everyone into crypto assets and then pull the rug. And when people say crypto is an inflation sink, I mean, guys, what's the total crypto market now? Just in the U.S., $1 trillion or $2 trillion or something like that, maybe higher. I haven't actually looked at it in a long time, but I'm not really sure what actual effect that has on inflation, because remember, inflation is too many dollars chasing not enough goods. And if you're going to go buy Bitcoin, that's money that you don't need tomorrow. That's money that you're not going to spend next week. You're not going to spend it next month. That's probably money that is otherwise sitting in a bank account or sitting in a safe, being gold or silver or something else. So I would actually disagree with you there. I actually don't think crypto is that much of an inflation sink. Maybe that money that's going into crypto is not going into groceries. Maybe it's not going into consumer goods. I think there's, I would just have to disagree with you there. But I'm open to the math. I don't. That's my opinion. But maybe let's look at the math and figure out what the math says.
Yeah. Total crypto market cap per tradingview.com is $3.8 trillion inside of the U.S.
3.8 trillion inside that's the total value of the entire crypto space. I haven't looked at it. I warned you, I haven't looked at it in a long time. So,
yeah.
All right. So roughly 4 trillion. Yep. A lot of that, though, but let's be clear. This is not $4 trillion US dollars that have poured into Bitcoin necessarily. A lot of this are people buying and holding. So they may have started out with $20,000 of Bitcoin, and now they have $1 million worth of Bitcoin. So this is. Again, I would disagree with that. I don't think crypto is that large an inflation sink. Just my personal opinion. All right, lots of people love Bitcoin. Lots of people hate Bitcoin. Jared, any other questions?
No other questions. There was one comment appreciating that we don't downplay questions and we answer them directly. So try to do that here.
Well, we try to the best of our ability. All right, everyone, thanks so much for that. That's going to do it for this briefing. It's also going to do it for this week. This afternoon, I'll have my economic early warning report coming out for Forward Observer members. If you would like access to that, join us over at forwardobserver.com. Every Friday afternoon, I publish what big banks and hedge funds are saying about the economy, about financial conditions, about monetary conditions. I tell you exactly what they're telling their clients. And, I typically write some commentary, things that I'm seeing, things that concern me. Try to put the pieces together of where actually is the economy headed? How close could we be to some crisis or worse? And that's available for subscribers. ForwardObserver.com. We'd appreciate your support, and you will ensure that we're back on Monday. So with that, everyone, thanks so much for watching. We'll be back in your inbox Monday morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.